introduce kind of what this event is for. So my name is Matthew Foldy. I'm working here at the University of Chicago. And so this past April, we had this conference at the University of Chicago about free expression. And so we had students from around the country, from 14 schools, including some of the people who are here in the audience, come to the University of Chicago to talk about free expression and to then figure out the best way to advance this on campuses around the country. So as you can see, there's this link, tinyurl.com/free expression, that is a link to this statement that we wrote up that is basically in support for free expression. So we've had over 1,600 people from around the world, including a lot of professors you guys are probably familiar with from around the country. And now we have students on over 40 campuses in Canada, America, and Mexico working on advancing free expression on their campuses. So this event here is hosted by the American University Students for Free Expression, and then Georgetown College Democrats, and then Young Americans for Liberty at American University. So we're really glad that you guys were all able to come, co-sponsor, and attend. And I will turn it over to our hosts, who are then going to introduce our guest speaker today, Jonathan Rauch.
Good morning, everyone. Today, as representatives for Students for Free Expression, we are pleased to welcome Mr. Jonathan Rauch here to American University. Mr. Rauch is a Brookings Institution Senior Fellow, author of 6 books, contributing editor at The Atlantic, and recipient of the 2005 National Magazine Award. A devout promoter of free speech, in 1993, Mr. Rauch published his book, Kindly Inquisitors, The New Attacks on Free Thought, a powerful defense of free expression in the classroom and beyond. As a staunch defender of LGBTQ rights, he has also published Gay Marriage, Why It Is Good for Gays, Good for Straights, and Good for America.
I believe we live in a time and a place where right now, at least in the United States and in some parts of the world definitely, there has come to this predisposition that free speech is a tool for hate speech. It is a tool for people that would like to speak out their most violent inner thoughts. There's this misconception that free speech is no longer the tool for liberal democracies, but instead is a tool in order to enact hatred upon one another. And we have come here today and we have started as this organization in order to show people that free speech stands for way more than that. Freedom of speech is one of the constitutive parts of what forms a liberal democracy, and it certainly has a place in a classroom and certainly in a university campus. It is the free and radical exchange of ideas that has allowed us to thrive for this long. And as long as people remember the importance of free speech and remember that it is our most powerful tool against hate, I believe that it is something that it is worth fighting for. So now, without any much further ado, I would like to welcome our guest speaker, Jonathan Rauch.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you all. I have a lot of thanks today. So many people helped make this possible. Daniel Acosta Rivas and Kai Fox and the other students who are here today. I'm going to talk in a few minutes about why you guys are so important. I am very proud that we're supported by the Institute for Humane Studies and the Koch Foundation, both of which have made this event possible. My old friend Tom Merrill, who's here today, who has helped organize and support this effort. I'd also like to recognize 2 gentlemen sitting in the back here on behalf of the university who will keep us safe today. That's very important. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. We understand and deeply appreciate the commitment that the university has made to this forum. Finally, there's one person I'd like to thank for not being here. That's Gregory Lukianoff, who's the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. I had something that last month that I think is bronchitis, though my doctor said it was just seasonal ickiness. He's a pulmonologist, so what would he know? It left me with a severe cough that just goes on and on. I'm physically fine, but cough when I talk a lot. And you may hear some of that today, but a couple weeks ago it was so bad, I thought I might not be able to speak today, and I got in touch with Greg and said, if I can't be there, can you pinch hit? And Greg kindly offered to be willing to be here if that came about. Fortunately, Greg is not here today, and fortunately I am, because I had decided unless I was completely incapacitated, I would be here with you all today because what you all are doing today is very important. It may be more important than you guys even are aware of at the moment. I have in the past, say, 6 to 8 months, received a number of phone calls from students at various universities, Princeton, Dartmouth, AU, one or two others, who were organizing on behalf of free expression on those campuses. And they were, pardon me, if you guys had like a jug of water or something, that might be a useful prophylactic. If I cough, by the way, I'm comfortable. It just makes you uncomfortable. So sorry about that. These were students who were organizing some pushback against campus activists who were shutting down debate and discourse on campus. What was interesting about all the students I heard from, including Mr. Acosta-Rivas, who's here, is that they're all freshmen. Isn't that interesting? I think what's happening is a new group is coming on campus, and they're looking at what's gone before, and they're saying to themselves, you know, I'm spending a lot of money and traveling a long distance to get an education at this university. And it is not right for some activist or interest group, some self-appointed university student or whatever, to deprive me of the opportunity to attend the courses that I want to take and to hear the lectures that I want to hear. And that is supremely important. It will not be my generation that figures out how to defend free expression for you guys on campus. It will be your generation that figures that out. And it will be the pushback that's beginning in this room that's going to begin that process. Every time someone is denied the right, the opportunity to speak on a college campus, a lot of other people are denied the opportunity to hear. All of those people are being robbed of part of their education. And what you guys are doing is saying, no, that's not right. We expect to get the education we came here for. I thought I'd talk for about 40 or 45 minutes. I may bump into another kind of respiratory problem in part of what I say, because part of this talk gets quite personal, and there's a part that I tend to choke up when I talk about. It's fine, it's par for the course for me. But before we do that, I just sort of wanted to sketch in where I think we are and how I think we got here, before I do a little bit of storytelling. We all know that there are problems with freedom of expression on university campuses, and indeed not on university campuses. We've all heard of the violence that occurred at University of California at Berkeley, at Middlebury College. We also know that much more commonly, we're hearing demands for censorship, we're seeing silencing, we're seeing sanctions. There are so many examples, such a wealth of examples. I'm just keeping my ears open because we're told we might get protested. All kinds of stuff. University of Virginia, 469 students and faculty protested when the president of the university quoted Thomas Jefferson on the grounds it was deeply offensive and created a hostile environment to even quote Jefferson because he owned slaves. University of South Carolina, this is an interesting one. So here's what happened. Here at Georgetown, a Hindu student put the symbol of a swastika on his door in the context of explaining that this is an ancient Hindu religious symbol. Now, this was not a Nazi regalia swastika. This was the ancient Hindu decoration. Some other student complained about the swastika on the door. The student was forced to take it down. University of South Carolina, other students then decided to have a free expression tabling event where they would display examples of things that had been censored on other campuses. The tabling event was held in the free speech zone on campus, and guess what? It was censored because it was displaying a swastika. That student sued. I don't know how the lawsuit came out. It is not just undergrads. A little bit shocking to me is that this is, if you're 18 or 19, I guess you can make a case that you're innocent and you come to campus and you expect to be safe and protected. But that should not be true of a 25-year-old graduate student. But at University of Kansas, a professor was investigated for 4 months for discrimination after she used what we now call the N-word in a graduate-level communications class as an example of things that she has not had to deal with seeing. She was talking about race and racism in the aftermath of Ferguson. She said, as a white woman, I just never have seen the racism. It's not like I see N-word spraying on the walls, right? So she is making a point about white privilege and racism. These were grad students. They said the context didn't matter. A student who complained says, I was incredibly shocked that the word was spoken regardless of the context. Before I left the classroom, I was in tears. Now, these are not children. These are grown-ups in tears because they're hearing words that offend them. Core political speech is not exempt. I'm sure you all heard the stories from just over a year ago, some universities. Emory, for example, which had special counseling sessions and so on after some students chalked Trump on the sidewalk. Now, that's core political speech, right? Supporting a presidential candidate. At my alma mater, Yale, a place which has not had a supremely proud record of late, a satirist actually went out onto the cross campus, which is, as it sounds like, the very center of campus, with a petition to repeal the First Amendment to the US Constitution, and had over 50 signatures in the first hour. That's a little depressing. So what can we say about this? One thing we should keep in mind is that at some level, none of this is new. In fact, it is very, very old. The idea of freedom of expression is the idea that if someone says something that is wrong-headed, heretical, offensive, seditious, prejudiced, etc., that speech should be not censored but protected? Are you out of your mind? This doctrine has two characteristics. One, it is the most counterintuitive social idea in the entire history of the world, bar none, that you should protect rather than ban expression that meets those criteria. Number two, not only is it the most counterintuitive social idea of all time, it is also the most successful social idea of all time. It has brought peace to societies around the world which previously settled differences of opinion by killing each other. It has allowed the creation of modern science and modern knowledge. It has allowed individuals and their freedom to flourish. But it is and always will remain deeply counterintuitive, and that means that people like me and people like you and your kids and their kids will have to get up every morning for the entire rest of time and defend this idea from scratch, from a new crop of people who think it's a bizarre idea and don't get it. Now, if that sounds depressing, it's not. It's just the way it is for free expression advocates, and we need to be cheerful about that. That's just our role. The arguments, really, none of them are new. They go back to Plato. They go back before Plato. But there are new variants. So here's kind of how I see what's happening now. 1989, under the George H.W. Bush administration, something called the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission promulgates a doctrine called the hostile workplace environment doctrine. That doctrine says if someone in their workplace is targeted by discriminatory harassment in the form of being called, ethnic names or slurs, and the workplace becomes hostile and they can't really do their job, that employers have a duty to prevent that. Well, that sounds like a sensible doctrine. I mean, if I go to work every day and someone, my supervisor says, hey, kike, hey, faggot, move that box, it's a difficult workplace situation. The thing is, the hostile environment doctrine pretty quickly got out of the box it was originally put in and began to be used. For example, someone complained that their employer was publishing a Bible verse on the paycheck and said that was creating a hostile environment. Another person who was a Christian, a social conservative, complained that another employee's photos on their desk of their same-sex partner was creating a hostile environment. Many more examples like that. Then the hostile environment begins to move out of the workplace and into society generally, and you begin to get a kind of syllogism. One, if you talk to people in a way that seems discriminatory or in a way that seems hurtful or hateful, that's not speech, that's action. That is a form of discrimination, as if you were denying them a job, for example, based on race or color. Two, that also makes the environment unsafe for them. They can't fully participate in that environment. They will be intimidated. They will be cowed. They'll be second-class citizens. It's a hostile environment, and that's a violation of their rights. Three, result of that, the authorities need to defend rights. That's why authorities exist. So, not being exposed to a hostile environment becomes a human right. In other words, free expression becomes a danger, a source of unsafety. This is beginning to sound familiar. But just preventing a hostile environment it's a kind of negative obligation, right? It's something that employers and universities need to prevent. Then we go a step further. In just the last few years, a positive duty is created, and that's the responsibility to create proactively a safe space. That means you don't just necessarily prevent stuff when it arises. You make sure that the environment at all times is not hostile to the people who come here. You get a positive obligation to shelter minorities. Now, this is not exactly new. One of my favorite examples of it actually dates back to 2010 because it's so counterintuitive that this would go on. But here's the situation. This is University, Illinois. It's the Department of Religion, and it's a course on Catholicism, where an adjunct professor by the name of Kenneth Howell is teaching a course on Catholic doctrine and includes in the course the teaching that homosexual acts are morally wrong, which, if any of you are Catholic, you will know is the teaching right now of the Catholic Church. A student complained anonymously, calling this statement hate speech. The complaint read, "The courses at this institution should be geared to contribute to the public discourse and promote independent thought, not limit one's worldview and ostracize people of a certain sexual orientation." The result of that complaint was that Kenneth Howell, presumably because he was an adjunct and not tenured, lost his job for teaching Catholic doctrine in a course about Catholic doctrine in the Department of Religion. Now, if that sounds a little nutty to you, remember that just down the block here at Georgetown, Love Saxa, a Catholic campus organization of students, promotes traditional family values and opposes same-sex marriage, as, by the way, do Orthodox Jews, most Christians, and most Muslims. And, by the way, as does the Catholic Church, some students demanded that the university defund this group because it was practicing hate speech. The university ultimately, thank goodness, declined to do that. But the point is, these are very much ongoing ideas. And these are profound and powerful ideas, right? The idea that we're all entitled to a non-discriminatory space. So, I want to spend the next half hour or so trying to go as deep as I can under those ideas to maybe help some of you get some ammunition for how to think about this and maybe develop your own ways better than mine to talk about it. But before I get to the meat of the issue, what is to me the most interesting part, I want to do, anyone remember Letterman's top 10? So I am going to reel off what I think are the top 10 practical problems with censorship, silencing, and proactive policing of safe spaces. I am not going to delve into all of these individually. The point of just ticking them off is to notify you that all of these arguments are out there. We can come back to some of them later if you're interested. And also because there are 10 of them, and a view which I can confidently defend is not a single one of these 10 arguments has ever been successfully addressed by the proponents of censorship, safe spaces, and so on. So, number 10, majority rules. Censors enforced conformity, because in a majoritarian society, that's where the votes are, that's where the money is, that's where the popular sentiment is. Number 9, special interests dominate. You know this if you've ever been involved in campus activism. The authorities don't respond to the strongest claims. They respond to the strongest claimants, the most organized, focused, and vocal groups on campus who may represent themselves as speaking for a minority, a majority, or for that matter, for oppressed minorities, but really are a faction speaking for themselves. Number 8, enforcement is inherently arbitrary, or it's inherently mechanical. Okay, wait, swastika, Hindu, Nazi, how do we decide? Is that offensive? Well, it doesn't offend me, maybe it offends you. Wait a minute, are we talking in the context of religion? Not religion. What about, can we teach Huckleberry Finn? Anyone read Huckleberry Finn? So you all know the problem with that book, right? It's the greatest of all American novels. Well, it's in the top 3. Some of you may put Catcher in the Rye or Moby Dick ahead of it. Can you teach that? Or is that hate speech? How do you make that ruling in a non-arbitrary way? There is not even in principle a bright line definition of the difference between hate speech and offensive speech. Number 7, the listener's veto, as they call it at the American Civil Liberties Union. When you put up rules saying that you have to have a safe space for everyone, that means the most easily offended person in the room, which in practice means the person who's quickest to claim to be offended, gets to decide what all the rest of us can hear. That's not fair to all the rest of us. Number 6, it's counterproductive. Martyring people with bad ideas does them a favor. Censorship showcases sociopaths. It gives them the court cases that gets them in front of the Supreme Court. It gets them attention. If your name is Milo Yiannopoulos, and you have never had an original thought, and you have never even had a profound thought, you can get famous by getting censored and by getting silenced, and your speaking fees go through the roof. Now, I am not getting protested today. At least not so far. Maybe there are protesters in the room. Raise your hand if you're planning to do a silent protest, turn your back. I mean, we can get that out of the way now if we need to do it. Okay, no hands went up. So I keep thinking, would my speaking fees go up if I came out on the other side, if I trolled you all today? By the same token, anti-PC backlash hurts the good guys. One of the major reasons, without getting into politics, but clearly one of the major things that helped President Trump get elected was his political incorrectness. People don't like it when other people shut them up or tell them what they can and cannot say. It doesn't work. It makes the situation worse, and we're seeing that in American politics right now because you get the resentment and then you get the backlash. Number 4, censorship is polarizing. It divides communities by elevating every dispute into this life or death struggle over who can say what and under what circumstances. And it creates an offendedness Olympics. It rewards people for saying, I'm offended by what you just said. You need to apologize to me. You need to give me something. So you get these escalated sort of offendedness wars. We see that dynamic in campuses. Number 3, candid discourse is chill. This one is depressing to me, but I've had students often tell me that they just cannot have a candid conversation about race or affirmative action or gender on campus. I've had graduates, recent graduates, for example, Harvard and Princeton. These are outspoken, extremely smart young people who said to me, this is a subject, as outspoken as they are, they just will not open their mouths. And I said, why? And they said, because it's all downside. That's what's known as the chilling effect. Any rule you put out there will be observed by the people who are not sociopathic, who are going to be careful. It will be flouted by the people who are sociopathic and want to get famous. Number two, the investigation is the punishment. Never forget this. People will sometimes say, well, we have a speech code, but at the end of the day, it comes out okay. Never forget that if you're a faculty member, or for that matter, if you're a student, the very fact of being investigated for months at a stretch, worrying about your job, worrying about whether you're going to be disciplined, whether you're going to get a letter in your record, and so on, this is harrowing. And that's where the chilling comes from. Even if there's no ultimate sanction, the investigation is the sanction. And number one, at the top of everyone's list, the problem that no one has come close to dealing with, authoritarian control. One of the reasons that speech codes and censorship and silencing get support is that people tend to imagine they themselves are doing the silencing. Well, if you're a progressive, imagine that you have speech codes and Donald Trump is deciding what you have to say. That's the thought experiment you have to run. Or if you're a conservative, imagine that Nancy Pelosi is the person deciding what you get to say. And if you're a student on campus and you're thinking about having a hate speech code, don't imagine yourself deciding what's hate speech. Take the person on campus you disagree with the most and assume that that person will be deciding what's hate speech, because they probably will. If we don't trust the authorities to look in our iPhones, why would we trust them to tell us what we can say and what we can hear? I submit no one has come up with an answer to any one of those 10, much less all of them. And that for all of those reasons, censorship and speech codes and silencing empower the powerful and organized. They chill the unpopular and marginalized. They operate randomly and unfairly. They benefit sociopaths, and they nurture authoritarianism. Other than that, they're fine. But I give you all that to kind of set it aside. All of those are kind of pragmatic arguments. And I want to try to go a little bit deeper today. I want to do something you may not have heard before. I want to go to the very root of the whole idea that hate speech is harmful, or that I should say hate speech certainly can be harmful, that allowing hate speech is harmful. And the way I want to do that is with a thought experiment. So let's imagine none of the 10 problems I just mentioned existed. Let's assume by some magic solution there was an authority that could perfectly enforce a speech code. It would eliminate only the bad swastikas. It would eliminate only the bad uses of the so-called N-word. And it would be right every time. Somehow, miraculously, we would all agree that it was right every time. And now let's make a second assumption. Everything okay?
No, I'm
okay, pictures. I thought of cell phone. I'm slightly on my guard in case. No, you're welcome to it.
Sorry, you're good. You're good.
Not at all. I couldn't see out of the corner of my eyes, and I thought, uh-oh, is that a security thing? Is that like the guy with the bug in his ear? Second assumption I want to make for this thought experiment. People talk about hate on campuses, and there are bad incidents, and they certainly happen. But in fact, American university campuses are the least racist, least hate-ridden institutions in the entire history of the galaxy. So let's go to the hard case. Let's assume a society that, to use the term of the scholar Jeremy Waldron, I think the best and deepest proponent of hate speech laws. Let's assume a community or society that, as he says, festooned with hate. Not like once or twice a semester you might hit something, or someone comes in from off campuses and puts up something terrible, or even on campus. You can't turn on the television, walk down the street, get online, or do anything else without being reminded that you are a detested member of society, that you are sick, that you are evil, that you don't belong there, and maybe that the likes of you should be exterminated. And it's everywhere. So let's make it really hard for ourselves, and let's ask the question, in that worst case environment, should we have a speech code? Should we have censorship? Should we have silencing? This is a truly unsafe space. We're not kidding now. Well, I want to submit to you that that is in fact not a thought experiment. That is the world that I grew up in. I was born in 1960 in Phoenix, Arizona, then a small town, Goldwater country. I am a homosexual. When I was born, and throughout most of the early years of my life, people like me could not work for the United States government. The government regularly held witch hunts. Did you all know that far more homosexuals than communists were punished during the McCarthyist era? We were barred from serving in the military. The Navy had an entire investigative service that specialized in rooting out homosexuals and discharging us. We could not have a secure job. We were fired from our jobs. Our churches and our bars were burned. We won't get into it, but probably few of you have heard, for example, of the burning of the Upstairs bar in New Orleans. Dozens of gay people were killed when someone locked the door to the bar and set it on fire. They were trapped and burned alive. Our churches were burned, dozens of churches. We were beaten on the street. We were often killed. You called the cops at your own risk because they were part of the problem. Police were especially fond of entrapping gay people on solicitation charges. And then they would arrest us, and we'd spend a night in jail. And then they'd drop the charges, but only after they had reported to the newspaper that this person, who happened to be the deputy principal of the school, had been arrested on sex charges, and that person would then lose his livelihood and possibly his family. We couldn't hope to marry, of course. That was completely inconceivable, but we also had to worry about being menaced with arrest in our own homes for the crime of loving each other. We were designated mentally ill by the psychiatric establishment. All you had to do was turn on the television to see that the homosexual was either ridiculous or sinister, or usually both. Anyone seen Diamonds Are Forever? Remember Mr. Went and Mr. Kidd? The menacing homosexual assassin couple? You know, typical. And of course, we were driven underground and assailed from the pulpits. You know, you turned on Sunday sermons around the country, and we heard that we were a stench in God's nostril. Now, today, as of 7 years ago, I am married to a man in the United States of America. And I want you all to know that although many of you take this for granted and can't imagine a world in which it's not the case, for most of my life, I couldn't imagine a world in which it was the case. It has been the most profound moral transformation that I have ever seen. Second in American history, surely, to the African American civil rights movement. But amazing and much faster. I call that a miracle. Miracles can happen. So how did we do it? So here's the answer. Millions of homosexuals formed the National Association of Homosexuals, raised billions of dollars in campaign contributions in order to pass hate crime laws in the 60s. We were then able to use those laws to silence our critics and remove them from the pulpits and basically to cleanse society. How many of you think that I just told the truth? No, obviously not. There were no hate crimes laws to help us, thank goodness, because if there had been hate speech laws, if there had been hate speech laws, they would have been used against us. Why? We were haters. We hated society. We hated order. We hated children. We were seducing children. We hated religion. We hated God. There were no laws to protect us from hate speech. If they had been, they would have gone the wrong way. We had no money. We had no votes. We were pariahs. We were underground. Very few gay people even dared to speak. It was revolutionary in 1965 when a couple dozen homosexual men and women had the first openly gay protests, right here, Lafayette Park, in front of the White House. The other one was at Independence Hall in Philadelphia. So how did we do it? No money, no votes, no political power, no organization, no nothing. The answer, with our voices. That's how we did it. We had free expression, and that's all we had. Okay, so why did we have free expression? Does the lapel mic work if I move away? Is this okay for sound? I can stay here if you want. Does it matter?
It still works. Yeah, you should be fine.
All right, let me stroll a bit. If it's a problem, just let me know and I'll go back to my appointed spot. So let me now give you a little history that most people don't know. I didn't know some of this history until a few years ago. 1953, magazine is founded called One, capital O, capital N, capital E. It's the first gay magazine. It's not a sex magazine. It's an intellectual magazine. Way back then, in the early 50s, it comes out for homosexual marriage, which is amazing. In 1954, it publishes a cover article, unsigned, called "You Can't Say That." This is an article about all the strictures that magazine had to obey in order not to be banned by the US Postal Service, which enforced the obscenity codes. Now, if you think about the 1950s, there was no internet. The only way you could distribute a magazine was through the US mails. If the mail said you were obscene, you were shut down, you were silenced. In 1954, the US Postmaster General banned One magazine, censored it on grounds that it was obscene. The particular article over which it was banned was an article that sort of, ancient roots of lesbianism, which was thought to be horrific. But none of you will be surprised to know that the issue was banned, that the cover story was "You Can't Say That," the attack on censorship, which was then censored. Funny how that works. One magazine got some help from a lawyer, pro bono lawyer, a man named Eric Jolber. He's still alive. He's in his 90s. American hero. They sue, First Amendment lawsuit. They lose in federal district court. They lose in federal appeals court. Postmaster General is upheld until 1958. Case arrives at the Supreme Court. The court issues a one-sentence per curiam decision. That means there's no explanation. It's just the will of the court. It says 9-0, the ruling of the lower courts is overturned. In other words, the Supreme Court said to the US government, you cannot ban this magazine. That was the day we got our voice. The federal speech code fell away. By coincidence, or maybe not coincidence, you decide. Right then, a man named Frank Kameny was fired from his job working for the US Army Map Service. Kameny was an astronomer, Harvard trained. He was a veteran of World War II. He'd seen heavy combat duty in Italy. He was fired after being arrested in one of these typical charges where he was, it's what I just described. He came on to somebody, he was arrested, he lost his job. That's how that worked. In those days, if you lost your job, you usually just slunk away in shame and agony. Kameny was not like that. Kameny challenged his job loss. First to the agency that had fired him. It's called the US Civil Service Commission. They would not hear his appeal. Then to the president. Then to the Congress. He started a letter-writing campaign. His letter writers consisted of himself. He received replies from members of Congress, if at all, saying things like, "You're the most disgusting person I've ever heard of." He went to the Supreme Court. He filed the first brief for gay rights in the history of America at the Supreme Court. He wrote it himself because he couldn't afford a lawyer. We'll come back to his brief in a minute. 1965, he leads those protests. This is the part of speech. It's hard for me to go through this without choking up a little. Don't worry about me. It's just, it does give you a sense of how deeply personal this is. 1965, he leads those first tiny civil rights protests. 1970, he becomes the first openly gay person to run for Congress for delegate in DC. In 1972 and 1973, he finally gets his success. After several years of campaigning and storming the stage here in Washington at what was then the Shoreham Hotel, the American Psychiatric Association retracts the diagnosis that homosexuality is a mental disease. Kameny called it the greatest mass cure in the history of medicine. 1975, the US Civil Service Commission revokes its ban on gay people working in the government. And gradually, so it goes. In the mid-90s, President Bill Clinton revokes the ban on gay people getting security clearances. So we can now work for the CIA and the NSA and the many jobs requiring security clearances. In 2003, the US Supreme Court overturns the sodomy laws after a couple in Texas is arrested in their own home for having sex. You know where this story goes, but you might not know all of it. Part that's hard for me to get through, because I knew Frank Kameny. He died in 2011. But he did live long enough to receive the pen from President Obama in the Oval Office when Obama signed an anti-discrimination order having to do with civil service employees. And he lived long enough to receive a public apology from the US Office of Personnel Management, and that office's Theodore Roosevelt Award, its highest prize. The Office of Personnel Management is the renamed US Civil Service Commission. So he received a formal public apology and award from the agency that had fired him at that point 50 years prior. When he received this at the ceremony, very Kameny-like, he stood up and shouted, "Apology accepted!" And those signs that he carried around in those little protests, which you can see on YouTube, look them up. Those signs are in the Smithsonian Civil Rights exhibit. At one point, they were displayed next to Jefferson's writing desk. Now, that's hard for me to get through because that is what I lived through. Okay, so rewind a bit. I mentioned Frank Kameny's Supreme Court case. I mentioned his brief. I want to quote from it for you. Two quotations. It's an amazingly powerful brief. You can get it on Amazon. It's been republished. Quotation number 1. In World War II, petitioner did not hesitate to fight the Germans with bullets in order to help preserve his rights and freedoms and liberties and those of others. In 1960, it is ironically necessary that he fight the Americans with words in order to preserve against a tyrannical government some of those same rights, freedoms, and liberties for himself and others. He asks this court, by its granting of a writ of certiorari, to allow him to engage in that battle. Notice what he says here. To fight with words to preserve against a tyrannical government the same rights that he fought for with bullets on the beach at Anzio. A fight that he points out is not a fight for gay people, but a fight for all Americans. Here's a second quotation. I had a bit more trouble understanding this because it puzzled me at first. The Commission's regulation, as it stands, this is Civil Service Commission regulation that homosexuals can't work for the government, is unconstitutional in that by establishing a tyranny over the mind of its citizens, it is inconsistent with and violates the provisions, stipulations, spirit, and intent of the First Amendment to the federal Constitution. Now, I thought, that's odd. Tyranny over the mind. Now, this is a discriminatory firing case, right? This involves losing your job because of a government rule. What does that have to do with tyranny over the mind? What Kameny understands is that what he's fighting for isn't just a job. It's the principle that you can be who you are and think what you think and express those thoughts without fear of sanction, of reprobation, of punishment. And he understands that the real purpose of laws that ban gay people from serving in the government is, in fact, to tyrannize the mind, to drive from polite discourse, to drive from American society the idea that gay people could be free and equal. Frank Kameny understood the stakes, and so should we. This was a case not fundamentally about employment rights. This was a case about dissent and the place of the dissenter in American society. So what I learned from that history and my own career of, 24, I guess, years, no, more, since 1991, of advocacy of gay equality, same-sex marriage. I've learned that the censors have a false model of where hateful prejudice comes from and what to do about it. They think it comes from words. They think it comes from people saying stuff, but they're wrong. Most Americans, in fact, there are a few who are sociopathic Nazis, but most Americans don't get up every morning and say, who can I hate on today? Who can I vilify? The reason for prejudice of the kind that I faced for most of my life isn't hate per se, it's fear and it's ignorance. If you think that I, the homosexual person, am going to sexually assault your child, that I'm going to recruit your child into the homosexual underworld lifestyle, or if you think, as a Christian or Muslim or Jew, that I am going to bring God's wrath down upon the country, or that I am convicting myself to an eternity of damnation, or if you think that I'm twisted and sick and have a mental disorder, I promise you, you will fear and hate me. And you will think that you are right to do so. Not out of animus, but you'll think you're doing it out of sympathy. How do you fight hatred and prejudice when it comes from that? There's only one way to do it. You have to replace the fear and ignorance with better ideas. You have to show people the truth. That's what Frank Kameny and many others did. It's what a lot of people tried to do. So the bad news is that this is a very slow process. It took a couple generations to get America from where it was to where it is. The good news is that by the standards of human history, this is incredibly fast, much faster than most earlier civil rights movements. And the reason for that is that we had more freedom to make the case, and we had more channels to make it with. What Frank Kameny understood is that you fight prejudice not by suppressing it, but by confronting and exposing it. I heard him do this. He was on a panel with a guy named Robert Knight, who's still around, of the Family Research Council. And I recall his saying, in as many words, if your God thinks that my love is immoral, then you worship a false and bigoted God, which is how he talked. Interesting thing about Frank Kameny is you could tell him he was a stupid fucking faggot. He didn't care. You were going to get it back from Frank Kameny. We changed minds by showing that we were on the side of love and the side of decency, and by proving the haters were wrong. And gradually they came to see that they were wrong. Many of them became our supporters and friends. And from that, I then learned two other things. First of all, we, minorities, I don't care what your minority is, are better off in a society that protects hate speech than in a society that protects us from hate speech. The second thing I learned is that there is nothing safe about so-called safe spaces, because they're safe for intellectual laziness, for ignorance, for moral complacency, for enforced conformity, and for authoritarianism. They are not safe for us. So assume, to go back to my original question, assume the hatred-festooned society and the magic perfect speech code. I would still be against it. It would not be confronting the problem to silence the speech that we don't like. It would be instead like fighting global warming by breaking all the thermometers. We need to know who the haters are, or they're not usually haters. We need to know who the people are with wrong-headed ideas so that we can see them, we can confront them, we can correct them, and we can compare ourselves to them. Here is something that you haven't heard much, but it's true. The haters did us a big favor in the gay rights movement. Every time Frank Phelps in Westboro Baptist Church went out and picketed the funeral of a military service member carrying a sign that said, "God hates fags," and every time someone saw that and compared that with gay people peaceably protesting or peaceably lobbying, saying, "We'd like to marry and express our love in the most socially responsible way," Fred Phelps sure made us look good by comparison. Haters in the end bury themselves if you let them talk. I recognize Frank Kameny was a very special guy. He stepped forward when almost no one else would. There are other pioneers. Don't have time to get into all that. But remember, we don't all need to be Frank Kameny. In a society that allows free expression, we only need a few Frank Kamenys, but they have to be determined, they have to make good arguments, and they have to have the opportunity to speak. And remember, it's always the people with the cutting-edge social ideas, the people who seem the most outlandish and wrong-headed. It's always from those sectors that society's moral insights ultimately come. That isn't to say that every person with a weird idea is right, but it is to say that most moral innovation, as H.L. Mencken said, is welcomed by polite society about as much as a wave of smallpox. Being in a minority, it's a burden, right? People say we're marginalized, we're oppressed. That's a bad thing. People talk about, a way to think about it is the minority tax. You come to a university that is majority white and cisgender and heterosexual and whatever, and you're a minority, there is a kind of burden of constantly justifying yourself, constantly explaining, defending, educating. Middlebury, some students wrote a letter, public letter, saying free speech was bad because it's a burden, quote, on specific groups of students, asking them to continually defend their right to exist in an academic community for the supposed intellectual enrichment of that same community. Well, I take issue with the word supposed. I think airing these ideas is real, not supposed intellectual enrichment. But the rest of that statement is in fact true. Minorities do face a kind of extra burden of self-defense. And by minorities, I don't mean necessarily people of color or homosexuals or women or whatever. I also mean intellectual minorities, the people who step on campus with the strange and unpopular ideas that just might have a kernel of truth. Is that unfair? Yes. Is it burdensome? Yes. For gay people, quote, defending our right to exist for the intellectual enrichment of our community was a pain in the butt. I promise you life would have been easier and better for me if I hadn't had to live through it. But here are some things that you don't really hear enough, I think, in the context of this discussion. One, please, I say this as a member of 2 certified oppressed minorities, gay and Jewish. If you don't believe the oppressed part, go to Russia right now for Jews. I'm sorry, for gay people. Also Jews in many places. Please, for heaven's sake, don't protect us. We don't want your protection. We want protection from violence, absolutely and unconditionally. That's why we thank those people in the back of the room. But please do not protect me from hateful, bigoted, wrongful ideas. We, gay people, fought for years against the stereotype of weakness and defenselessness. Remember the words that were used for us? Limp wrist, pansy, fruit, sissy. Am I your inferior? Am I a sinner? Am I a sicko? Well, tell me. I am not afraid to hear that. And guess what? You're going to hear back from me. A lot of campuses have these things now apparently called bias incident reporting systems. Do you have that at AU?
Yes.
These are like anonymous complaint boxes where students can complain about things other students are saying without apparently putting their name on it, and can launch investigations. So as you can imagine, I don't like that idea for all kinds of reasons. But there is a bias incident reporting system that I support very strongly. And here it is. If you're biased against me, report it to me. And you will hear back from me. I will not run to the university or the government and say, please protect me from this awful person. I'm capable of doing that myself. And indeed, that is essential, I think, for minorities like me to retain our self-esteem and our respect for ourselves. Second, hate speech helped us. As I said earlier, it gives us a foil. It lets us prove our mettle. It lets us make our arguments. It gives us a platform. And finally, you know, the tax of being a minority in a majoritarian society, whether it's a campus or America, it is a burden, but it's also a gift. Dissidents and minorities and outsiders see society better. We pick up things that other people miss. We're society's consciences, moral pioneers. We're the canaries in the mine shaft. We're interesting. We have a story. And we also have the privilege of advocacy to make the country better, to make the university better. And that's also something we need to be a bit more cheerful about, I think. In Middlebury, the student letter I mentioned praised the courage of protesters who had shut down a lecture by Charles Murray, a controversial conservative scholar. The letter said, and I quote, "They took the great risk of standing up." I'd like to take exception to that. I don't think it's brave to try to silence ideas you disagree with. I think it's a form of cowardice to do that. I think bravery comes from confronting those ideas rather than hiding from them, shielding yourself or trying to shield others. Minorities do bear a special burden. We always will. We should embrace that burden, as Frank Kameny did. It's interesting to me to note that in his very long career of activism, in his very aggressive career, Kameny never once called for anyone to be censored or silenced. That was not in his playbook. He meant it when he said he was fighting for the freedom of all Americans against tyranny over the mind. We should talk for a bit. I went on for a bit too long. I didn't cough, though, which is kind of amazing. But just to add a footnote, I've said these things at a number of universities, and the question that most often comes up, usually from a white male, though not always, is how do I respond to the white privilege mic drop? You know, the check your privilege mic drop, where you try to say something and someone else in the room or in the class says, you're not entitled to say that because you're a member of the privileged class, or you're white, or you're male, you can't understand what minorities go through. And they say, how do I protect myself from being disqualified from the conversation in that way? What do I say? And I thought of a lot of things to say, you know, and kind of rattle them off. Like I would say that they're cry bullying, or just, you know, I'll make arguments for free speech or whatever. And none of them seemed quite right. And that's when I realized I was thinking the wrong way about this. The answer are two things. First of all, if this happens to you, the important thing isn't what you say to them, it's what you do, which is continue to speak. Do not allow yourself to be silenced. They do not have the power to silence you unless you give it to them. That's the first thing. And the second point is, what about what to say to them? And that's when I realized I can't tell you that. The people in this room who are students on this campus today, not me, not the faculty who are here, your job, if you're sympathetic to the kinds of ideas I'm discussing, is to figure out how to speak the language to your own generation in your own words to carry this conversation forward. It never sounds alike from generation to generation. My father was old enough to live through, as a baby. How many of you have heard of Ulysses by James Joyce? Some people think it's the greatest English language novel of the 20th century. How many of you knew that it was banned in the United States in the 1920s? A lot of heads nodding. That's good. We have some civil rights historians in the room. It was banned and it was physically burned. It was imported, and federal agents had a big book burning, like in Nazi Germany. That was a very different time from today. The challenges always change. We beat that one back. We will beat this one back. But the vocabulary and the thinking has to change too. And what I hope you will do, what I charge you with, what I depend on you all to do in this room, and the reason I was going to be here unless I was completely incapable of speaking, is that the job that you are starting to do here at AU and other campuses is the job of developing the vocabulary for your generation to take this fight forward. And really what I'm here to do is thank you for doing that. So, do we have time to talk for a bit? I haven't been looking at a clock. How are we doing?
Yeah, we still have some time to talk, yeah.
So comments, thoughts, pushback. It's always more fun when people disagree.
Can I do a question?
We have a microphone.
Yeah, I mean,
Oh, yeah. Do you guys want to? If you all could introduce yourselves.
So when you guys are asking a question, also say what school you're from, because we don't only have AU people. So.
thank you so much for that riveting conversation. That was phenomenal. That's probably one of the better arguments I've ever heard for free speech. So I'm a student at DePaul University. Actually, 2 weeks ago, we had Dr. Charles Murray, come speak to our student body over at DePaul. And it actually went very well. We do not have a good track record with free expression at DePaul, but administration gave us the green light on that, and we had very productive and peaceful protest outside of that. But what I want to get at is not necessarily the role that administration plays in the university, but more how we bridge the gaps between students that fundamentally disagree. I made the argument with some protesters that were primarily DePaul socialists that walked out, that by walking out and disagreeing with his economic theory, which just only feeds the fire of a disagreement with, you have, like, let's say, a free market economics professor versus a progressive economics professor. And when you have that authority figure, when you make it about identity, how much can you really stay on topic without having emotion overpower intellectualism in that sense? So what I'm going to ask you is then, what do you think would be the ideal way for students themselves to go about interacting with each other in a way that can bridge these gaps rather than draw us farther apart because of identity?
Well, that's the easiest question ever, because the answer is, what do you think is the way students can talk to each other? So I can't really answer that. I've been talking to a lot of students, and I did a little informal survey of undergraduates who were interning at Brookings, of whom there are quite a bunch. And what I came away with was kind of interesting and surprising, though not apparently to folks who've been on campus. So back when I entered this debate in the early 90s and what wrote Kindly Inquisitors, the big problem was you had these very ideological faculty who were developing arguments against free speech based on minority rights and objectivity being an oppressive class-based concept and so on. Very ideological and coming from the faculty. The students I'm talking to now paint a very different picture. And when I surveyed them on this, I actually gave them a poll. What they're telling me is that the pressure now is not primarily coming from faculty or administration, and it's not your traditional censorship-based speech code of someone coming down on you from above with a ton of bricks. They're saying it's grassroots pressure from other students. Students are getting ostracized, they're getting the eye-rolling treatment, they're getting the Snickers in class, they're getting the Facebook posts and the social media hits if they say something that's unpopular. And a large minority, not a majority, but 40-some% of the students I polled said that this was significantly affecting their own educational experience. But a consistent theme is the problem now for them is social, and it's coming from students. It's not sort of authoritarian coming from the administration. So if you're someone like me, and you go around making classic free speech arguments that date back to John Stuart Mill, or if you're someone like Greg Lukianoff at FIRE, who's a lawyer, who specializes in getting colleges, especially public universities, to back off their speech codes because they're unconstitutional, this is a bit of a dilemma because it's a different kind of problem, right? You don't solve it by going to the administration and getting them to back off their administrative action. And you don't solve it in court with a First Amendment lawsuit. And you don't really solve it with John Stuart Mill arguments against government. You've got to figure out how the students can begin pushing back against this social pressure so that they can feel free to talk to each other in an unchilled way. So here's the other thing I heard this when I surveyed students. They don't think that these activists who are doing this chilling represent a majority of students. They think they represent an organized, a large, substantial, but like a third of students, not much more than a third of students. And they think the other thing that's happening is that the students who object to silencing and eye-rolling and all that sort of thing are not organizing to push back. And they themselves don't want to do that because, I'll graduate in 2 or 3 years. Why should I take this on? So your job is to answer the question you just asked me. How can you get, the people in this room are the beginning. And they're the beginning, I believe, of something big. And I'll say another word about that in just a second. But how can you begin to turn this group and the other seedlings that are going to sprout up into students talking back to these organized factions and saying, no, we're entitled to hear stuff and you're not entitled to tell us what we can listen to. That's not allowed. We won't stand for it. We will protest you. I can't tell you how to say that. It's totally up to you. The ball is 100% in your court, and that's why being here is so important. You all might be interested. A few days ago, a man named Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, social psychologist, NYU, a very big name, founder of something called the Heterodox Academy, which is trying to introduce more balance into the social sciences. Politically center-left. He gave a speech for the Manhattan Institute. It's online. And he predicts, he's not confident about this, but he says he talks to lots of college presidents, and they're just getting fed up with this culture of repression and this culture of chilling. They don't like it. And he's hearing it now from so many of them that he believes that there is going to be a tipping point in the near future. He's guessing maybe the next academic year, not next term, but a year or two from now, when college presidents are going to start really getting on the bandwagon for free speech, and they're going to get serious about fostering a better campus climate and saying, if you threaten someone and shut them down, you can't do that here. He's also said he's seeing what I'm seeing when I said I'm hearing from freshmen. He's seeing the student pushback that is just beginning to arise, including at Reed College, which is a hotbed of progressivism. And he's looking at you guys, and he's seeing what I'm seeing, which is you. And he's saying, the students are going to start pushing back, and that's the game changer. When that happens, that is the game changer.
Okay. Hi, I'm Gavin Gabrick. I'm from the University of Maryland. So the threat from free speech, it now seems to be coming from the far left. And many of the defenders now of free speech are people on the right and the far right. And so many of these alt-right people have cloaked themselves sometimes as defenders of free speech. Milo Yiannopoulos has done that often. Some of these really actual racist rallies have been, they've called them free speech rallies. So how can we draw a line and really distinguish ourselves from them and not let this be appropriated by them?
Interesting. We have support for that question. Let's ask the person who clapped, if they feel like it, to ask if they want to. Did you want to elaborate?
I'm happy to say something. Who do you want to?
Go ahead. Yeah, please.
So I'm Tom Merrill, I'm a professor here.
Was that you who applauded?
I was the one who applauded the Department of
I guess you got an A in that
I
quote.
was going to ask. And the reason I want to ask the question there's something that, many of you who are here on campus know that we've had several high-profile, I think unambiguously racist incidents on campus that have been roiling our campus and that have been genuinely troubling to many of us because they seem so mean-spirited. And this question that the gentleman just asked seems to me so important. I was in a faculty meeting, not in my department, but in a larger university, and someone raised their hand and said, in today's climate, the phrase free speech has become a synonym for all right. And at first I got angry and I said, that's not right. That's not the way that I see it. I am a supporter of free speech, but that seems wrong. But then I thought about it. There is something about the way that we treat the phrase gets used in our media world right this second that does seem to lend itself. So let me put the question to you this way, that I think is the same thing that he was asking. Aren't there a lot of creepy people marching under the banner of free speech at this moment? How should we think about those things?
So it's a great question. It comes up a lot. There was a place where Nadine Strawson was protesting. She's a progressive. She's a former ACLU president. And she was protested because free speech advocates like the ACLU believe in protecting free speech for everyone, including people with unpopular ideas, which unfortunately includes people like climate deniers and Holocaust deniers. And it even includes outright racists and Nazis. So a few answers to that, though I'd like to hear what others have to say. One is, I can think of times in the past when people with morally ludicrous, dangerous ideas took advantage of laws defending and customs, norms defending free speech. I mean, people who believed that slaves from Africa were fully the equal in every respect of white people, that was just insane and abominable. Oops, they were right. How about this? Take the most perverted people in society, the child molesters, the people going against all our shared values, people with a mental disorder, and put them in Lafayette parks with signs. You're telling me you're going to allow that? Where does that end? What if you get a homosexual rights movement that springs up across the entire country and turns the entire country into a hotbed of liberty for gay people? So here's the problem. I'm a Jew. I don't like Nazis. I lost relatives, great aunts and uncles, to the Holocaust. Thank God my grandmother got here long before that happened. So please, no one tell me that Nazis are bad, okay? Let's just not even have that conversation. The problem is, of course, that you never know in advance who's going to turn out to be the Nazi and who's going to turn out to be the abolitionist. And the only way you find out is by putting them out there and seeing what happens. So that's point number one. Point number two, when you ban those Nazis, you do them the biggest favor in the world. Here's something that Fleming Rose points out that I hadn't realized, but he did the research. Weimar Republic, you all know what that is? Germany between the wars, had a hate speech code. The Nazis, the real Nazis, deliberately ran afoul of that hate speech code, which protected Jews, among others, by being as offensive as they possibly could, and then running against it, saying we're being oppressed and intimidated by society just because we're trying to tell the truth about the Juden. That was one of the things that made Hitler popular, playing against those laws. So when Richard Spencer or some other reprobate like that says he's a defender of free speech, I say, fine, give it to him. Let's see how he does in the marketplace of ideas, because I know the answer to that question. What I do not want to give him and others is the tool that will really help them the most, which is a big government court case, a lot of violent protests. That amplifies the voices of what are, in fact, a few hundred people, some of whom belong in jail and the rest of whom sit on their, in the basement on their laptops in their mother's house. I do not want to give those people any more amplification than they already deserve. And when Milo Yiannopoulos comes to speak here, could you please just ignore him? Like if he faced a room with 10 people and several crickets, wouldn't that be a much better message to send? Hey,
And I'm also a journalist at NPR.
I know the name.
Of your work for many years.
Mutual.
Let me just say, ask a question about the difference, and maybe it's linguistic, and maybe it's an administrative question, but for those of us who teach or try to administer a process at a university, is there a meaningful discussion, and I think this is something you've thought about a lot, between what is tolerance for certain ideas and what appears at least to be university sponsorship in certain kinds of contexts, where a speaker is given the same sort of forum as other speakers, which begins to look like not just tolerance and interest in ideas, but sponsorship. Is that something that you've thought about? What are your
I haven't thought a ton about it. It comes up in the context of, for example, I just began but didn't finish before we started a conversation about some courses apparently that are now going to be required at AU, which some people regard as actually pushing ideas of a certain kind. I'm for tolerance, but I also believe that certainly private universities are entitled to have a point of view. I certainly welcome it. If a university responds to some kind of hateful idea on campus by saying that offends our values, we're going to defend your right to say it, but we deeply object to it. So I have no problem with universities taking moral positions. I do have a problem if they compromise intellectual honesty or the standards of rigorous scholarship to do that, and I fear that that does sometimes happen, though you would know much more about that than I would. I just wanted to say one more word about the previous question, because I'm not sure I got quite to the exact question, which is what about the idea that free speech has become a right-wing idea, which is kind of tragic. Because if there's one thing that historically free speech was not, it was a right-wing idea. Most opposition to free expression down through the ages has come from the right and been used against the left or minorities or other people with radical views. And the answer to that is simple. In a society that is overwhelmingly left-wing, free speech will be a right-wing idea, because those are the people who need it. In a society that is overwhelmingly right-wing, free speech will be a left-wing idea, because those are the people who need it. In a lot of colleges right now, because of the lack of intellectual diversity, you have a climate that is overwhelmingly left-wing. Alas, in that situation, it may be inevitable that people will regard standing up for the rights of right-wingers as a right-wing thing to do. And we just have to keep trying to explain, as we have been through the ages, hang on a bit, the wheel will turn, and you will be sorry if you give up your speech rights. So. Thank you, Ron, by the way.
Thanks. My name is Casey. I'm a freshman at Georgetown. You talked earlier about the Love Saxa debate and what happened there. So this is somewhat of a personal question. I'm a gay man, and I have had trouble talking about that specific topic with other members of the queer community simply because it's very overwhelmingly against free speech, and I was just wondering if you have personally faced any sort of ostracism from the LGBTQ community based on your views on free speech, and how do we go about changing the narrative in those communities that are focused on identity?
So again, the answer to the second question of how you change the narrative is easy, because it's a mechanical response. You have to figure that out. That is your job. That is not my job. That is your job. And you will figure it out. You're a freshman. You've got 3 years. You will figure out ways to push back against those people and get the intellectual space you need to make your case and thrive. Have I been ostracized? If you mean by society as a whole, yeah, for many years. I still remember fall of 1995, I was about to write my first big article in favor of same-sex marriage, and I remember my father begging me not to do that, not because he was against gay people, we had a good relationship, but because he said this idea was so ludicrous and so insane that it would end my journalistic career to even come out in favor of it. Like, no one would hire me because I'd be a crazy person. And unfortunately, in 1995, that was not an outlandish prediction. It didn't work out that way. But yeah, dissidents are always treated that way, and we always will be. In my personal case, because I'm a journalist, that gives me a lot of freedom. And I've always basically been an outsider and a dissident I've always been the gay person who is center-right, and back in the 90s with Andrew Sullivan and some others, we actually started a group to push back against the idea that if you were homosexual, you had to be a down-the-line leftist. And we never trolled people. We made very serious arguments. But we also didn't mind being ostracized, because we saw that when they start talking about us, when they start going to the trouble of ostracizing us, we're already starting to win, because they're having to pay attention. That's how it worked with gay marriage too, right? At first when people just ignored it, we got nowhere. But when people started getting really offended and upset at us, that's when we said, okay, we're starting to push a few buttons. Now, we did it civilly, we did it with argumentation. As I say, we weren't trolling. It's really hard to be a university student and be ostracized. Like if you're a 20-something or 30-something independent journalist and you're writing for New Republic and Atlantic, no problem. I mean, it's a trademark. If you're an undergrad and you're 18, 19, and you want to be popular and you want to get invited to the right parties, it's a very different situation, I think. And part of the job that you guys have is how to navigate that. But remember, there's nothing that they can really do to hurt you. And remember, something I always remember when I give talks like this, if there are protesters around, or if I'm arguing for something that seems completely crazy, that the person you're talking to isn't the person you're directly talking to. You're not going to be able to persuade that hardcore LGBT left-wing activist that your point of view is correct. The person you're talking to is this person standing about where Daniel Acosta-Rivas is, who's listening, who is hearing what you're saying. He or she, maybe they're not saying anything right there, but they're seeing this confrontation. They're seeing you sound reasonable and the other person sound dogmatic and censorious. And they're walking away from that, and they're quietly beginning to think, maybe that activist isn't right. So in the gay marriage debate, I always remember, talk to the quiet people in the room, the people who aren't saying anything, the people in the middle who haven't made up their minds. Don't worry about the hardcore on the other side. You'll never get them. So maybe that's helpful. The last thing I'd say in response to that is this is something that just so breaks my heart. As a minority rights advocate who is gay and who grew up with the civil rights movement, I'm old enough to remember Dr. King from when I was a kid. These were people who were sticking up for the rights of everybody to be their own best and truest selves. That's what we always understood the gay rights movement to be. It wasn't just gay people at the expense of someone. We were standing up for everyone, including conservative Christians and Catholics and whoever, to be their truest selves within the reasonable boundaries of the law. And it breaks my heart to see minority activists, when they find themselves in a position of power, to engage in the very tactics of censorship and stigmatism and dogmatism that have hurt us so badly over the centuries. It's how it is, but it breaks my heart. I just talked yesterday, as it happened. Recent Columbia graduate, identifies as queer, said the same thing you just said. The LGBT groups on that campus were just completely, they shut her out. They don't listen to anyone. They've got this, she described it as almost being like a religion. You gotta push back, and you gotta keep moving. Hope that helps a bit.
Good morning, I'm a French student from Johns Hopkins. I would like to ask you...
Where in France, may I ask?
I'm from Paris.
Welcome, wow.
I arrived a little bit late, so I might ask you something you already said. I wanted to know what was your thoughts about the actual status of free speech in the US, and how do you think activists can influence lawmakers in DC? Because I feel like your ideas are underrepresented in all things in DC. So, what are the tools you may use to influence?
That's a big question, a good one. What are the tools for free speech, and what are the big problems that need to be addressed in Washington? The interesting thing right now, to me this is a very good thing. Some of you might disagree. In the world I grew up in, the government was consistently the biggest threat to free speech in America. like they were shutting down one magazine and they were burning the greatest novel of the 20th century. In my time, in my adult life, my lifetime, not my adult lifetime, one of the things that the US courts have been especially strong on is expanding and defending speech rights. And that, by the way, has not been a partisan movement or an ideological movement. It's come from both sides. So I'm here to say that although there are specific problems I have with specific government policies involving stuff like campaign finance laws and workplace harassment laws, the government is actually not the biggest problem for free speech in America, which is an amazing thing to say when you think about the fact that most governments throughout most of human history have waged war against freedom of expression and are still doing so in most of the world. The problems we have now are more social. They're the kinds of problems we're seeing on campus, where you've got extreme conformity of opinion and it's causing oppression of people who disagree with that opinion. The other problem we have, which is new, and I don't know how to respond to, and it's a very different kind of problem and a very different conversation, is what I call troll epistemology. And that's not a threat to free speech. That's the threat of the use and abuse of multiple channels of information to spread disinformation and lies at such a rapid speed that you can't keep up with it. And no one knows how to cope with that. And that also is not a government problem. And no one I know thinks that there's an easy government solution. So you guys, those of you who are undergraduates, Kai and Daniel and the rest of you, you face this really interesting period that I didn't. We knew what our target was, gay rights activists. We did not want to be censored by the government. We did not want to be arrested by the government. We did not want to be denied marriage by the government. We did not want to be kicked out of the military by the government. Well, we've accomplished those things. You guys live in this less clear world where you don't have that clear target of the government where you're going to sue it and change it. To go back to my main theme of the day, your job, and it's a hard job, is to figure out how to make social change at the grassroots level so that you begin to win over that, what I think is a silent majority of students on this campus and off this campus who want free expression but may not understand what to say to the activist who says free expression is a right-wing idea that oppresses people like me, or people who haven't quite made up their mind. That's a harder thing to do. That's social change. That's cultural change. And that's the mission you guys have all had. Thank you so much for hearing me out. It's been such a privilege to be with you.